The subcommittee will come to order. I'd like to welcome everyone to this hearing of the Emerging Threats and Capabilities Subcommittee of the House Armed Services Committee on the important topic of information technology. Several of us from the committee recently had a discussion with Eric Schmidt, who is the executive chairman of Alphabet, as well as the chairman of the Department of Defense New Defense Innovation Board. That discussion was very helpful in provoking us to think about how the department could do a better job incorporating best practices from industry. And while it is unrealistic to think that DoD will ever operate exactly like industry, it is nonetheless imperative that we achieve every ounce of efficiency out of our back office and IT operations in order to fully invest in combat capability. The challenge is finding that correct balance, and today's hearing brings us one step closer. Information technology represents over $30 billion of the department's total budget. However, too often it is treated as a support tool secondary to platforms, weapons, training, and the operations of the department. But anyone who has seen U.S. forces operate over the past 25 years understands that our military advantage comes from those network systems providing the intelligence, precision strike, information fusion, and warning capabilities our warfighters have come to rely on. This committee has been focused on reforming the operations of the department for the past 2 years, from streamlining acquisition regulations to streamlining an overly cumbersome bureaucracy. The end goal of these efforts has been to enable us to buy and develop systems with greater agility and flexibility so that state-of-the-art tools get into the hands of our warfighters faster. I know our witnesses today will help provide us with a better framework for understanding how to think about defense management and acquisition practices for information technology as we explore the critical questions before us, such as what are the characteristics of well-performing programs that we should focus on? What leading indicators should we be monitoring to determine if programs are going off the rails and before it is too late? And how can we better identify, encourage, and reward those program managers that are executing information technology programs well? Let me now turn to the ranking member, Jim Langevin of Rhode Island, for any opening comments he'd like to make. Jim?
Thank you, Chairwoman Stefanik, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. I definitely look forward to hearing what you have to say, given your wealth of knowledge in this area. So management and acquisition of information technology at the Department of Defense is one of the most challenging and pressing DoD organizational and administrative issues facing us today. For years, Congress, the executive branch, and industry have attempted to bring DoD's IT programs and processes into the 21st century. Despite attempts like the Joint Information Environment and streamlining of acquisition processes, DoD's pace to improve its IT posture is not progressing with the desired speed to achieve serious efficiencies, increase security, and take advantage of enhanced capabilities that are readily available. For example, the intelligence community has developed and is using commercial cloud services, yet widespread use of cloud computing has not yet taken place at the Department. All that said, I will be the first to acknowledge that the Department of Defense IT management, modernization, and cyber are extraordinarily complex. I will also acknowledge that Congress, in an attempt to be helpful, has taken action that has seemingly had the opposite effect. So that's why today's hearing is so important. IT management and modernization experts who served at the DoD sit before us. I look forward to their concrete recommendations for improving DoD's IT posture in an expeditious manner, and I hope that they provide granularity on legislative, regulatory, and cultural barriers like risk adversity that are inhibiting the rapid change required. And I'm certainly glad that they help us understand what is working, as well as highlight the successes the Department has already had in this arena. So with that, Madam Chair, I thank you for organizing this hearing. I thank our witnesses for being here today, and I yield back.
Thank you, Jim. Today we welcome 3 distinguished witnesses, all of whom have served as senior officials within the Department of Defense, and so they not only understand the government challenges with information technology management and acquisition, but also how private sector practices can be applied or need to be avoided. First, the Honorable Peter Levine, former Department of Defense Deputy Chief Management Officer and Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness. Next, the Honorable Terry Halverson, former Department of Defense Chief Information Officer and Department of the Navy Chief Information Officer, and Mr. Ed Greer, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Developmental Test and Evaluation. Welcome to all of our witnesses. I'd like to remind you that your testimony will be included in the record, and we ask that you summarize key points from that testimony in 5 minutes or less for your opening statements. And Mr. Levine, I'll start with you. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Chairwoman Stefanik, Ranking Member Langevin, and members of the subcommittee, I thank you for the opportunity to appear here this afternoon to discuss DoD's information technology management and acquisition processes. What I'd like to focus on, with your permission, is DoD business systems acquisition. For years, DoD has been trying to buy new business systems the same way that it buys weapon systems and other big-ticket items, and the result has been a series of sometimes spectacular failures. The fact is that there is no such thing as a standalone business system and no such thing as a standalone business system acquisition. The DoD's business systems are interconnected not only with each other, but also with the business processes that they run. When DoD wants to acquire a new financial management system or logistics system or HR system, it inevitably finds links to dozens, if not hundreds, of other IT systems which either feed it data or rely on it for data. Each of these systems, no matter how outdated, redundant, or ineffective they may seem, has a core of devoted users who are likely to resist change. DoD tries to ensure that change management and business process reengineering take place concurrently with new business systems acquisitions, but it has not been easy. Acquisition officials don't have the authority or expertise to require their customers to do business process reengineering when they buy new systems, and management officials responsible for those business processes have proven to be incapable of running large acquisitions. In the last couple of years, Congress has helped this issue considerably by streamlining Section 2222 of Title 10, which provides the statutory requirements for DoD business systems acquisitions, and by repealing requirements for major automated information systems, or MAIS programs, that mimic the acquisition process for major weapon systems. When I testified with Terry here last year, I promised that the Department would take advantage of the new flexibility granted by Congress to better coordinate the roles of the DCMO, the CIO, and AT&L in the acquisition of business systems. 2 weeks after that hearing, I left the position of DCMO to become acting Undersecretary for P&R. But I'm pleased to say that that effort, that streamlining effort, went on in my absence, and that just a couple of months ago, the Department issued a new DoD instruction addressing business systems acquisition. This new instruction appropriately sequences for the first time decision points regarding business solutions, IT solutions, and acquisition solutions, so that we don't have these redundant processes going on side by side without reference to each other, but we have a coordinated process. This is also the first step toward building an IT-specific acquisition process, as the Defense Science Board recommended almost a decade ago. Consistent with the DSB's recommendations, the new instruction establishes a unique set of decision points for business systems acquisitions and requires prototyping and incremental delivery of capability. I would have to say, though, that the DSB report, which is a 2009 report, recommended a unique acquisition system, not just for the acquisition of business systems, but for the acquisition of all IT. And it has been a disappointment for those who were here with the Congress. I was on the staff at the time that report came out, that still hasn't been fully implemented for IT. Congress felt strongly enough about this that you enacted provisions on this twice, first in 2010 and then in 2015, telling the Department, please go look at this DSB report and figure out a way to implement the kind of IT unique acquisition system that the DSB is recommending, having looked at commercial practices and figured out how they would best apply to the Department. I commend you to look at that report. It's still the right thing to do. It's still what the Department needs to do. So while significant change, I think the Department has made good steps in the direction of changing this. There's still a long way to go. The one thing I'd add before I wrap up and hand over to Terry is that the issuance of a new DoD instruction like this one I just mentioned is the beginning of a process of change, not the end of a process of change. One thing that I've seen in the Department is it takes every bit as much effort to make sure that the instruction, the legislation, the regulation is really implemented in the spirit that was intended as it does to enact it in the first place. So it will be up to the new team at DoD when it arrives to ensure that the new processes are appropriately implemented in practice, and in particular with regard to business systems, that the CMO will have to remain engaged throughout the acquisition lifecycle to ensure that the department adopts new and efficient business solutions rather than tailoring new business systems to old and inefficient processes. With that, I thank you again for inviting me here today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Levine. Mr. Halverson, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Chairman, Ranking Member, distinguished members, thank you for the opportunity to testify today before this committee. This is an important topic, and I would like to echo much of what Peter just said. Obviously, we did testify together on this topic last year, and I did testify the last 2 years on this topic. DOD has made progress. They continue to face critical global challenges. I do think they'll meet those challenges, but it's faced with an added and unprecedented dimension. This is arguably the period in history with the fastest developing and most complex technology. Unlike previous times, the vast majority of this technology growth is occurring in the private sector, not originating with the government. This means in addition to identifying the right capabilities to meet DoD requirements, DoD must be able to acquire and integrate this technology with greater agility. Today's environment demands more broadly defining capability and not providing detailed requirements that dictate solutions. At times, the government process today, because of their current thinking, delivers legacy solutions. We really do need to think about how we talk about capabilities and not dictating a series of technical requirements that will be out to date the day we publish them. DoD needs a better understanding of the commercial environment to become more effective and efficient in working with the industry and determining how solutions should be implemented. With respect to business systems, DoD really needs to ask itself, should it implement whole commercial solutions or some degree of hybrid solutions retaining some government capability? I'll echo what Peter says, this also needs to focus on the process, and I strongly recommend that the going-in position for business solutions until proven wrong through business case analysis is that the government and DoD should be adopting commercial solutions off the shelf. The real question really is what businesses should DoD be directly in and where should it offload those businesses to the commercial sector? Regarding systems that are more aligned with the primary mission of DoD, such as national security systems, DoD must more carefully weigh the mission risk, the mission security requirements, and since these systems are more likely to be operated by military or civilian members, DoD must really look at the workforce implications of training and sustainment. The new changing environment also means DoD will be requiring more services from industry as opposed to just buying products. To successfully buy services in this exploding technical environment will require DoD to form better partnerships with industry and for industry to be more open to sharing technical data with DoD. To facilitate the building of these critical partnerships, I believe this committee and others will need to look at the laws governing relationships and contact between DoD officials and industry members and expand those programs. The laws we have today have been written with great intention, but they are outdated. Many of them, from a financial perspective, still use numbers from the 70s. They don't make any sense, and they limit the ability for DoD and other government agencies to function correctly. We also need to look at the way we test commercial products for acceptance and security perspective today, and I elaborate this in my written testimony. The security accreditation process is costing both the government and industry lots of money and doing a disservice to, in the case of DoD, our service members for how long it takes to get those products certified. We insist on testing stuff that's commercially been accepted and tested in industry. We need some legislation that says, why can't I accept that testing as the official testing? Test, can the government operate it correctly? 100% that testing should be included, but we really need to look at how we do the testing. That has become one of the long poles in the pen. You have to improve efficiency. I will talk a little bit about the McKinsey report, about the $125 million. DoD definitely took that report seriously, but some of those numbers in there were not well thought out in the end. But they should be continuing to refer to that report. It does give the right topic areas that DoD should be looking at to gain more efficiencies in. As Peter, I am happy with the DoD CIO and the DCMO relationships. I think it's strong today, and I think it will continue to get better. That's important because it's the combination of the process and the technology. In the end, this is a little bit about a cultural solution more than it is laws and anything else. We need to think differently. I think we have unintentionally been building for a long time a culture of distrust, and one that was based on overregulation and a foundational belief that all the players, industry, government, and academia all needed to be protected from itself, and we've done a good job at doing that. Somewhere we've lost what was good in the systems we had prior. I was quoted as the DoD as saying that our secret weapon was our commercial capability and our relationships with industry. I would amend that to read our secret weapon is our commercial capability, our relationship with industry, and the combined efforts of the military, civilian, contractor, and commercial workforce to make it all work and deliver the results. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Mr. Greer, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Subwoman Stefanik, Ranking Member Benjamin, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to express my views this afternoon. In 2013, this same subcommittee hosted a roundtable discussion on IT acquisition reform, and it seems like the same challenges and the same issues were discussed 3 or 4 years ago. So we do need to be mindful of what kind of progress we have made. Today, I'm going to talk about May's challenges, best practices, the role of developmental test and evaluation, and business systems versus tactical weapon systems. May's challenges. The challenging nature of May's acquisition can be attributed to many factors. I will briefly discuss 3. Program complexity. Typical Maze programs have to be integrated into multiple existing and emerging enterprises that contain a large number of government and commercial entities. Another challenge, unstable requirements. In many cases, the changes are driven by advancements in technology, vendors updating hardware, operating system upgrades, and so on, or by changing world events. And the third challenge, build versus buy. While many IT companies regret building enterprise software solutions because it was much more expensive than expected, there are times when custom software solutions is the right answer. A rational build versus buy decision starts with well-defined requirements and a quantifiable outcome. Second, the best practices. There are many best practices within the commercial sector and within DoD. I would like to highlight just a few. Executive leadership participation. Robust and continued senior level attention and participation contributed significantly to the success of agile Maze acquisition programs as documented in the DOT&E 2016 annual report. When senior leaders are on site, they can add resources as necessary, and they can also shorten the decision cycle time. Another best practice, continuous developmental test and evaluation. The program office should have a coherent DT&E strategy to find and fix problems as each software component is developed and delivered. Deficiencies are much easier to fix before integrating into modules and components. And the best practice of evolutionary acquisition, which is a method intended to reduce cycle time and speed the delivery of capabilities to users. Often in an evolutionary model, the development of increments must occur in parallel to deliver capability on time. The third topic, the role of developmental test and evaluation. Conducting DT&E in an agile environment must be done early and often. During a major weapon system development cycle, 80% of the test and evaluation is developmental test and evaluation. There are DT&E organizations within the services and at OSD. I have worked in both. They serve a different purpose. The DT&E professionals within the services are typically funded by the program managers, whether it's acquisition programs, Maze, or whatnot. And they are potentially subject to biased reporting due to the pressure from the PMs. I've seen it firsthand. The OSD DT&E organization is not funded by the program managers. They are mission funded and therefore independent. And the last area to talk about is business systems versus tactical weapon systems. It is important to make a distinction between cyber and IT/IA policies for warfighting systems and those pertaining to business systems or corporate enablers like email, common business systems, and cloud applications. Technical laboratories and communities should be held accountable for making recommendations for IT consolidation and savings, but should control their own destiny in determining the best solutions. There's not a cookie-cutter approach. To ensure there's an appropriate focus on the cyber systems engineering, it is now time to pair a traditional CIO function with an RDT&E warfighting system cyber assessment function, which is focused on the tactical weapon systems and RDT&E infrastructure. That concludes my remarks, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Greer. We now turn to members' questions. My question is for all three participants in the panel today. Industry best practice calls for the use of leading indicators as a way to measure the health and performance of a sector. However, DoD, as you know, tends to focus more on lagging indicators because they are easier to measure, but they don't do a very good job of helping decision makers decide if a program is performing well or not, at least not until it's too late. What kinds of leading indicators should we be using to measure IT programs, as well as performance of our acquisition systems, and what are the obstacles to being able to collect that sort of information currently?
One of the first things we ought to do is concentrate on money. That's what industry does. We do look at how is the money being spent, and if you find that you're starting to have undocumented rising costs, that's generally a pretty good indicator that something's wrong. Performance is the next best thing. If you look at industry, they'll look at performance. And it's not the performance of how the acquisition process worked. You ask what are one of the problems? We grade the acquisition process. Now, I'm going to say everybody in this room has fault in that. I did, and so does the legislation, because it requires that I had to report on how I was doing in the process. Most acquisitions, the day they were finally declared unfit, still had green in checking the acquisition process. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So why aren't we looking at performance in the field? I mean, industry, if I'm going to grade it, I grade it, did it meet the customer requirements? That ought to be the number one, and track the money. If we did those two things, we would absolutely have a much better system today. And then get out of the rules and laws that require that we have to track and produce, is the acquisition process itself being followed? The acquisition process is part of the problem. So I really think if we followed, you could take these templates right off industry guidelines. We're not different in that respect. And track the actual outcome performance results, not the process.
I think that when we look at the DoD acquisition system, not just for IT, but for anything, you need to recognize that we rely on our contractors for almost all the data on their performance. So we need to be careful about what kind of data we prescribe, because if we say we want more data, then we're adding a contract requirement and a new regulation to a system where we don't need a whole lot of new regulation. I would add to what Terry said about tracking dollars, though. It's important not just to be able to track dollars, but to be able to link dollars to performance. And certainly with the acquisition system in general, I've always felt that earned value management systems are one of the most important things that we have, because they don't just track how much money you're spending, but track it against measurable milestones so you can see whether you're progressing in the way you thought that you should be progressing. Now, some of our contractors have earned value management systems, some of them don't. It depends on whether, if they're government contractors, if you're a Lockheed or a Boeing or somebody like that, you'll have an earned value management system. If you're a commercial contractor, you may not have one that matches government standards. So we may need to figure out how we can work within data that is otherwise already provided and collected by commercial industry to determine these things without imposing new requirements.
Industry does a very good job at quantifying their requirements. They stay rigid with their requirements. They develop the product based on quantifiable outcomes. They also make it a priority to make sure their senior leaders are proactively engaged. They are on site where the decision time is much shorter. Proprietary data is an area that, as Peter mentioned, is a concern. In some instances, it's difficult to get our hands on the data, and when we do, it costs us dearly. So that's an issue. The last one is a partnership, perhaps, an integrated product team with industry so we don't have to worry about lagging indicators. We'll be right there working with the industry, developing the leading indicators and monitoring the leading indicators.
Thank you. I now yield to Mr. Langevin.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to thank all of our witnesses for your testimony. So to carry on this point, in your opinion, what do you think is the most, the single most important action both Congress and the new administration can take to enable rapid modernization of IT? I know it's a broad question, but kind of following on with our discussion, please give us your insights. And the other one, I'll say, in your opinion, what cultural barriers, such as risk adversity or service preferences, exist within the department, and what recommendations do you have to overcome them?
So the first thing I would say is we need to push the authority to acquire down, and we can do that in small numbers. So, I mean, here's an interesting thing. In my previous job, I was the CIO. I had a $37 billion budget. Approved that. It's the only place in the DOD where, as a single entity, my CIO, I had to approve that budget, write that budget, yet I couldn't authorize directly $1 million to, if I saw great technology, to put right on the table. That doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to me. I think that's the first thing I would do. Smaller numbers, controlled. Give it a limit of maybe $10 million total that the CIO could say, yes, that's great technology, I want it, and waive some of the requirements that an institution as big as DOD has to review every piece of that against some competition criteria. That does not make sense. Part of the time, if I can see best practices in industry, and that's where industry is going, I ought to be able to say, as the CIO, industry CIOs do that. They say, this is where industry is going. I'm making the decision, and we go. We could do that, try that, small amounts of money. I think that would really drive some rapid acquisition quickly. The second thing, and your question about what else do we need to do, I would really recommend that this committee establish a group, and I think in 90 days they could get some very good results. But stack it with both industry and military business systems owner, not just the technical guys, because in the end, back to our original question, I've never had my customers, DOD soldiers, sailors, Marines, and civilians, are not real shallow and are not real, they will tell you what the problems are really quickly in language that you'll get to understand quickly if you go ask them. We don't ask them enough. And so I think that's the other problem. Let's go out and ask the customers, bring some customers on this panel, bring some industry experts, bring some leadership. 90 days, I think you could get a really good result on here are some of the specific things you could do to really get at the cultural issue, because this is cultural. Even when it's fixed, and even when we have the authority, the whole system, which includes the DOD way we inspect and review, and frankly includes the way GAO inspects and reviews, we're using the mindset that was 20 years old. We've got to change that. That will take time. But I think this committee, because it's done it in the past, could establish that committee, take a review, and put some things in legislation, and then follow up on it with your personal attention, and that would get some good results.
Thank you, Mr. Green.
I'm going to agree with Terry that I think that the real focus ought to be on planning and prioritization so that you're spending the money in the right place. We tend to focus in a hearing like this on what's wrong with DOD's policies and practices and how can we make things better through that, and we can make things better. But if you're really looking for how are you going to improve the IT environment at the Department of Defense, whether it's in business systems or weapon systems, the issue is we have a lot of low-hanging fruit out there, things that need to be improved. we don't necessarily spend our money in the right places for the right priorities, and that prioritization, I think, is the number one task that we have.
In response to your first question, contracting is, in my mind, a major impediment, whether it's acquisition weapon systems or IT systems or whatnot. If you look at the entire food chain of how, from A to Z in terms of delivering an IT agile system, it starts with the statement of work, then it goes into a do loop in the contracting arena because of policies. It's not the executors, it's the policymakers, whether it's in OSD or the echelon command within the services or more pointed here at Congress, a legislation that's been burdened on the contracting community. Conducting a zero-based review of all of the contracting policies certainly might be one approach. I mentioned earlier about the CIO, and my personal view is, and I am an engineer, I have the technical background more so than the IT side of the house, but certainly the CIO has such a broad responsibility. That's another long lead time approval cycle. It has been from my experience. In terms of cultural barriers, a lot of the government organizations do have in-house software development teams, and sometimes they make less than informed decisions regarding whether or not they should develop in-house software solutions or go out to the commercial sector. And I believe that's a cultural issue that ought to be addressed. Thank you.
Thank you. I yield back. I'll have additional questions if we go to second round. But,
Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Gentlemen, thank you for your service. And Mr. Greer, you mentioned that proprietary data and how much you said it cost us dearly, I believe is the term that you used. And regardless of what weapon system it is or IT system it is, I mean, we've seen examples in the past of where we as the government, we paid for the research, we paid for the development, and then in an error in the contracting, even though we paid for all of it, some private company ends up owning that data. I assume that we're not making that mistake anymore. Is that something that we've corrected in the contracting?
Congressman, I'd be happy to respond to that. If, the Congress did change the rules on that several years ago, about 3 or 4 years ago. I was with the Senate Armed Services Committee then, but you changed the rules. In particular, there was a rule that said, you know, the way that rights and technical data work, if it's 100% developed at private expenditure, it's the private company owns it. If it's 100% developed at government expenditure, the government owns it. And if it's mixed expenditure, we get just government purpose rights. But those rules also said you have to identify in the contract up front which data you're going to have ownership of as the government. So even if it was developed exclusively at government expense, if we failed to identify it up front, we didn't own it, and the contractor would come back and tell us, well, we own it now because you didn't say in the contract, so you're going to have to pay through the nose to use what you paid for in the future. We changed the law so that it said, given that we were supposed to own it in the first place, if we failed to identify it in the contract, then the amount that we will owe you to provide us that data is the amount that it takes to produce the data. We're not going to have to pay you monopoly rights to buy it from you again. So we did make that change, or you did make that change in the Congress a couple of years ago.
Okay. I just know that as somebody who represents a depot, this is a problem for us in supply chain management and some of the older systems out there where we paid for the development of a product and we're having to then pay for the schematic to manufacture the part because they don't have it anymore.
It's been a huge problem. It should be better going forward, but of course that doesn't get us all the technical data from contracts in the past that we wrote under this old system.
Absolutely.
And I might add, for just a couple seconds here, even if it's just one piece of small source code within a weapon system, that will hold us hostage. And that is what's happening today. So you can have all of the lawyers get together and come up with compromises, generate legislation, but at the end of the day, the major prime contractors are still holding the government hostage.
The change that we made a few years ago, the change that Congress made for a few years ago also attempted to address that by saying that you have to segregate the smallest piece of technical data that you actually spent your money on and isolate that and tell us how we can work around it so that you can't tell us that we have to pay for all of the technical data or rely on you for all the technical data. So there's an attempt to address that as well. There's also currently, I believe, Congress
Is that attempt effective, or do we need different language to make it more effective?
I believe it's effective, but it needs to be implemented and practiced over a period of time to see whether the problems with it. Congress has established a technical data panel to look at these issues. So, and I suspect that, with all due regard to my friends in the contractor community, they're going to try to reverse some of these changes. So I would urge you to be very alert to the recommendations of that panel and make sure that there isn't backsliding on those issues that you're concerned about.
If you would provide additional information to us on that, I would be very appreciative of it. Gentlemen, it took the Army 10 years to decide on which new pistol they were going to use. I don't know if it was because of the law or the bureaucracy, but the iPhone came about 10 years ago. The original iPhone, flip phones were still popular back then. With technology, that's certainly a timeline that we cannot operate in. Is it the law or is it the bureaucracy that needs to be changed?
Yes. Some of the laws still need to be restructured on that. There are some things that still treat off-the-shelf technology like a weapon system. We have got to stop doing it. We really do need to say off-the-shelf technology, commoditized technology does not need to be treated like a weapon system. But then we've got to get through the bureaucracy.
Do you have any specific language that you could suggest to provide for our committee?
I will shoot you. Yes, sir, I will do that.
I would very much appreciate that. Madam Chair, I'm down to about 20 seconds. I'll yield the remainder of the time.
Thank you. Ms. Gabbard.
Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen. I wonder if you can comment on what impact, if any, you think the Buy America provisions have on obtaining the best possible technology.
It has always been a concern in the acquisition community that if you have Buy American provisions that become too restrictive, it will limit our ability to get the best weapon systems for our warfighters. The acquisition community always has a bias toward getting the best possible for the best possible price. As long as the Buy American provisions are in the area where they are now, the acquisition community has been able to work around them. But there's concern if you ramp it up too much, it might impede their ability to do what they need to do.
Yeah, I'll echo what Peter said. There are some cases where, unfortunately, you can't buy American in much of the technical side. I think the other thing we want to talk about here is that part of the Buy American also addresses some security concerns. What we really ought to be looking at, and this is maybe a bad way to say it, is where don't we want to buy? Very candidly, I don't want to buy stuff, and I didn't want to in my last job, that was manufactured in certain nation states. I think that needs to be more of the focus here. And what I would say, the words here, we might in the technology area want to change that to Buy American and Allied. The other problem we have in the technology communications business is we don't go to war alone. The DoD does not, and we need to be able to communicate effectively with allies. So that is something we've really got to make sure that agency by agency we don't put out Buy American rules that would preclude us from then communicating very well. I also think there's great benefit if we focus this around Buy American and Allied and how we could do some better arrangements for everybody in terms of cost, delivery times, and production.
Outsourcing integrated circuitry is a concern that I've had for quite a while from a cybersecurity and trusted systems point of view. We are second to none when it comes to manufacturing integrated circuitry and mass producing or producing small quantities. But the outsourcing of the large quantities is something that we all have to be concerned about, only from malware perspective and other reasons.
I would echo what Terry said, though, that there's a difference between worrying about your supply chain vulnerability, where you're worried about countries of concern, and what you do with Buy American, which is to say that all countries are off the table.
Right. With regard to, you mentioning Buy American and Allied, what are some of the approaches that our allies are taking with regards to some of these challenges with workforce and improving their own speed of acquisition? There are lessons we can learn.
There are. So, an example like the UK and Australia, their CIOs are permitted up to, I think it's 10 million pounds, to look at existing technology and say, hey, this would fit, let's buy a small amount of it, let's test it, let's put a performance objective around it and track the cost performance to Peters. They have to have those, but they can make the commitments right on the spot to do that. That makes them a lot more attractive to new technology, because if you're a startup new technology, you're on a 6-month funding cycle. You don't get that 6 months, you're walking away. You have to. So that's something we could do. They also have changed their workforce constructions. My counterpart in the CIO at the UK until just recently, he retired March 31st, was what they called a crown contractor. To get around the pay gap issues, they were able to negotiate not quite a civilian salary, but better than the government salary, and they were able to hire him for give him full civilian authority to make the decisions, but he came out of both industry and the military. He'd been a retired 2-star, he did 5 years with British Telecom. I think that's kind of what we want to be able to bring into the government, people who have both government and industry experience. You need both to succeed at the top level. The Canadians are doing the same thing. In the way they're doing their supply chain, also all those nations which are in the Five Eye, and there's only one nation that doesn't have this authority, and it's probably the leading nation in the Five Eye community, which would be us, they're allowed to look, as Peter say, check a supply chain. So there are some U.S. companies that I wouldn't want to buy from, because when you look at their components, they're all from countries I don't want. That's the most important thing. So they're allowed to say, hey, if that is a UK company, but all of their parts are sourced out of a place we don't like, well, then we're going to go buy an allied company. We ought to have that kind of flexibility and restriction to make those decisions when it's in the best interest of defense.
Yeah, thank you.
One thing that the last administration did, if we want to look to a domestic example rather than overseas, is to have teams of IT experts who came in from Silicon Valley to help DoD and other agencies and look at specific problems and identify solutions. So they'd identify commercial solutions. Sometimes they'd write software themselves to address it. I believe that the new administration is considering similar kinds of steps, but that gets you ahead of a cycle. You don't have to take 5 years to develop.
We've run out of time, Mr. Levine.
Thank you.
Dr. Abraham.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Gentlemen, thank you for your direct testimony. It's appreciated with some great solutions or possible solutions mentioned in y'all's testimony. And as we know, industry has to make a profit. They have a board of directors that they report to. And unfortunately, in the DOD or any bureaucracy, that word's not even in their dictionary. And, that is a problem. Again, it all comes down to accountability. And when you have a budget, Mr. Halverson, of $37 billion or whatever, and you can't write a check for something that you see would, it's just idiocracy at its finest. So it is a national security issue, and I understand we have to maintain qualitative and quantitative advantage over our enemies, but for these programs that we could just literally pick off the shelf and save literally hundreds of millions of dollars, it just, it bodes poorly for us in the government for us to allow this to happen. Are there any examples? Can you give me some examples of some successful industry partnerships?
Well, I hesitate because some of those I was directly involved in, but I will tell you the Microsoft partnership with DoD, the ability that Microsoft let us, looking at the license agreement, let me at that point make the decision that the entire department could go to Windows 10, get to a single operating system without having to renegotiate the current contract. That was a partnership with Microsoft that what they saw down the road, and I think this is going to happen, if the government goes to Windows 10, to one of the representative's comments earlier, it will actually facilitate then the follow-on move, which I know is being planned, into the 365 and public cloud domain. So Microsoft saw that as investment. It was a good open dialogue. That was very good. Again, I hate to say it, I'll go on the record, I am now working for Samsung, but one of the things that happened early, we put out a capability statement that said we needed a secure smartphone. That's all we put out. Samsung came in, we worked with them, and we actually co-developed what today they feel is their NOC security system. It kept everybody prices low. We were able to field that at the secret and now top secret level in less than 24 months. The products, which are rare in my history, were delivered on time and at cost, and in the end, they actually cost less than we thought they would.
That leads somewhat to the second question I have. Mr. Scott referenced the iPhone 10 years or less, and again, these products are being developed by a different generation of entrepreneurs, engineers, IT people. What are we doing to attract some millennials into the fold?
Not enough. We're going to have to address a couple things on that. One of them is the pay gap. I will tell you, I lost my director of security. You know, he went and he quadrupled his salary after spending, 32 years serving the government. Good. That's one thing we're going to have to address. But we're also going to have to address some of the other things that the millennials want, which is they want their technology. I mean, one of the things that when I went in my old job and now in my new job, I talk to millennials, why don't you look at DOD? Well, because they'll take my phones away. I won't be able to do the things I want. Now, that's not true as much anymore. We're using multi-factor phones, those type of things. But there is the perception that the government lags greatly in the ability to be flexible in the workplace. We've got to get that message out. The rules are there. I mean, the laws are there. I mean, I could let my people telework. I could do those things. It just wasn't the way we thought. That's a cultural issue. The laws are there that can make that happen. That's something that maybe these other committees ought to be asking some questions about. What are we doing on the millennials? What are we doing to be more flexible in the workplace? There's some good answers to that, but that needs to be the holistic plan, not just individual efforts.
A minute left, Mr. Levine.
If I could just add one thing to that. We don't take advantage enough of the things that we do have to offer. I think that the most attractive thing for the Department of Defense, for people who work there, is the mission and the feeling of commitment to the mission and that they can make a difference. And I think that we don't take enough advantage of that. We don't sell that well enough. When we treat civil servants as bureaucrats who are just too much, there are too many of them. We need to get them out of the way. We need to fire them and cut their pay. It doesn't create the image that people want to see of themselves, and we need to do a better job of selling the mission to get the kind of people we want.
And just one or two points here. In the IT community, I believe that we have to raise the level of our professional series. We have a lot of non-professional IT specialists, and they serve a very good purpose, but where we are today with the cyber vulnerabilities and resiliency challenges, I think making sure that we hire enough professional series in the IT community is important. And it's not necessarily the pay that is attracting, like Peter said, it's the quality of work for these millennials.
Thank you, gentlemen. I'll yield back.
Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Greer, can I talk a little bit about your build versus buy conundrum in your testimony, in your written testimony? I'm sorry for being late. You may have addressed this, but I wanted to ask you, in your experience on this build versus buy tension, generally, are there some criteria that we should be thinking about where there's a leverage point within the DoD where they ought to build versus they ought to buy in general?
That's a difficult question to answer in a short period of time, mainly because there's a hybrid solution. There's a lot of commercial software packages like SAP that we do purchase, but we use government people to program it and code the SAP system. And so that's always an issue.
Sorry, Mr. Halverson looks like he's excited to answer too, but
Well,
go ahead and finish.
I'm just expressing my views.
That's great, yeah.
Okay, and this is why I'm here.
So go ahead and continue.
But in terms of having firm requirements
Yeah.
and quantifiable outcomes and making that make-buy decision, it gets difficult within the government, mainly because of cultural issues. There's a lot of software programmers in the government, and they inherently lean in the in-house solution side.
So let me ask you this then, are there specific build versus buy decisions sort of on cloud computing? Is that treated differently than, say, operational software, like on the Microsoft decision?
It should be, but it's generally not for culture. But I'm going to be very clear on this. If you can buy it, buy it. We should not, and that I did not find that to be as difficult for anything that wasn't a weapon system as some people had. If you can buy it, we should buy that, and we should put, and we really did try to do this. I mean, one of the plaques over my desk was customization bad. You should fight every attempt we take to customize that software off the shelf, because every time we do it, it's a lifelong contract for contractors without much gain. Our business processes and systems, back to Peter's point, don't differ that much from the best in industry. They shouldn't if they do. So one of the first criteria is if it's a business system, you should have to come in with a different business case that says why I'm not buying that solution, why am I building any specific software. It's getting that way for many communication systems because we're using off-the-shelf communication. If it's off-the-shelf, really consider why you need to put something extra. And in a communications area, it might be for cybersecurity, but I have found if I go to industry, when I did that, if I told them I wanted that extra, most of the time they were happy to put it in, and most of the time they carried that in their commercial product because it was going to sell more as security becomes more important.
The track record of the department is if we're buying a commercial type business system, if we start tailoring it, we end up spending more money on the tailoring than we spent on the system in the first place. It just doesn't make sense to do anything unique unless you absolutely have to.
I'm sure if we went back to the first hearing that I attended on this issue when I was first elected in 2001, a lot of the answers would be the same. On the build versus buy, then can that principle apply to the people? For instance, in Washington State, we have the example of the National Guard working with private sector and public sector folks on cybersecurity and doing red teaming and doing some mapping out of how to approach defense. And some of these folks are reservists, and they're trying to attract folks in for 2 weeks a year and 2 weekends a month. In a sense, buying people as opposed to building them internally. Does that model work in terms of the IT personnel acquisition side, if you're acquiring people?
It certainly needs to be part of your plan. It can't fill all the bounds, and there are some security issues that you might not want to put everybody that way, but absolutely we need to be taking advantage of that. I mean, if you look at our last sets of operations and you look at the reserves we put on board, many of them were with those technical skill sets. I mean, as the CIO, and I was there, I would reach out and bring reserves on who were working for Google, working for whatever big company. That is, and it is actually part of the deal. I will give DoD great credit, but they actually have that in their plan. Continuing that into other areas, I think, makes sense with caution. It's not as easy to do that with people as it is with software, but it is something that we are certainly ought to be looking at.
Yeah. Contractor support is an area that we need to leverage even more. There's always a need for inherently governmental personnel to be able to represent the government, but I think we can leverage more on the contractor support side, especially as your workload goes up and down, you're able to make adjustments much more quicker.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much to each of our three panelists, Mr. Levine, Mr. Halverson, and Mr. Greer, and thank you to the members for their thoughtful question. This is a critical issue that falls under this subcommittee's jurisdiction that we will continue to focus on as we prepare and draft this year's NDAA, and we look forward to continuing to engage with you to get your suggestions. Thank you very much. This hearing is adjourned.